After a decade-long civil war, Guatemala faces the challenge to reintegrate its society. What they do is they create a commission that is supposed to investigate cases of crime by the state, by different sectors, and deal with the huge impunity that exists in the country following the late 90s when these peace accords are signed. And then after years of a commission dealing on a kind of low-scale crime resolving base, all of a sudden something unexpected happens. They start going after the big fish, after people in private sector, in business, in powerful positions that could be considered the organized private sector. What happens when this starts to occur with elite? What happens internally amongst the different fractions in the elite? It creates fear, it creates surprise, it creates antagonism, it creates dissidence, and it creates a disciplining where people are not willing to express their opinions anymore out of fear that something will happen to them. And about these internal dynamics of elites in a situation where all of a sudden they are challenged by powerful voice that is internationally heard, Alejandra Colom wrote a book that's called Discipline and Dissidents. Alejandra Colom is a professor of anthropology in Guatemala. She's an applied anthropologist, and she's also the director of the foundation Ichcanol, which uses cinematographic tools to fight for human rights and their recognition. And Alejandra will be joining us today to talk about the post-Civil War dynamics in Guatemala, what happened to this commission today, the fact that it's not active anymore, what does it mean for society, and what are the consequences for people that deal or that investigate these issues like herself. Alejandra, welcome to the program.
Hi, Alice. Nice to be here. Happy to be here.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. We want to talk with you about Guatemala and about its elites. And specifically, we want to talk about your book that was recently published that's called Dissidence and Discipline. Highly recommended for anybody. For now, I think there's only a Spanish version, or is there?
There's only a Spanish version, yes.
So if you read Spanish, go ahead and get it. And if not, wait until the English version comes out.
Exactly.
Hopefully soon. Alejandra, you called this book about elites and about their consents or the power that lies in their consents and how they can stifle controversies, or that's the subtitle of the book, Dissent. Do you call it Dissidence and Discipline, which sounds almost like a Jane Austen novel or something like that?
Yes.
Is that on purpose?
Yes, it is on purpose, and it's actually not my title. As an anthropologist, I have a hard time thinking about titles that are short. I tend to do the long descriptive titles. But the editor of the book, who is a journalist, he kind of wanted to a play of words exactly around titles like Pride and Prejudice or Crime and Punishment. So it was a mix between Jane Austen and Dostoevsky. So he suggested a few, and we liked this one. He and I agreed on this title. And I think that the name has really helped to attract readers beyond the usual academic readers.
And it has, of course, attracted a lot of controversy also, maybe because of the title and certainly because of the context and the content.
Yes.
So do we expect when we read it, do we expect something Dostoevsky-ish or what, drama, or what is it that we're looking at?
There is drama because Guatemala society, as many Latin American countries, although they have large populations, we are 14 million. Society is still very segmented. So books like this, you need to write very carefully because you have to hide the elements that are identifiable of your participants, and sometimes it is really hard because their stories are known by other people. So people can say, "Oh, she interviewed such and such," even if I do my best to mask some of the characteristics. And of course, there was controversy for various reasons. One is that about 6 years, In 2014, I did my first research on elites at a time when it seemed that at least a part of the elite, the economic elite of Guatemala, was leaning towards the fight against corruption. It seemed like they were moving in a direction of sustaining a more inclusive society. And so at the time, the first study that I did was at this time of hope, quote unquote, at least among certain entrepreneurs. And then when I did this second round of interviews, I do have some of the same participants, but in general, the doors had been closed because between 2014 and 2019, many things changed in Guatemala politically, particularly after CICIG, which was the International Commission to Fight Impunity, started identifying the links between corruption in the government with corruption in the private sector.
Maybe we can take a step back for people that don't know the Guatemalan context so well before we get into the content of the book. Can you explain what the CICIG is and why it is such an important body to understand what's going on in Guatemala today and connecting to its recent or medium recent past?
So as I think most of the audience will know, Guatemala went through a 30-year-long civil war, during which many atrocities were committed by the state and the army against indigenous populations, but also a lot of persecution of activists, of professors, of journalists, pretty much anyone who dissented, who opposed the government was killed, disappeared, or had to go into exile. So the peace accords of 1998 represented this time of hope for many of us. At the time I was at university, and I remember how there was a lot of openness. Were all the think tanks and the research centers were finally being able to study what had happened during the war. So when I was an undergraduate student, and I was very hopeful that my career would allow me to go into all subjects and all fields because the war was over, right? So of course you cannot restart from zero, and what the type of society that was described in the peace accords was a really hard one to achieve, considering that we were political orphans. Most of the leadership had died. We had no idea how to organize ourselves because organizers were all dead, and so part of the peace accords included a series of new institutions at the government level that were supposed to ensure that we could transition into a peaceful, law-abiding, inclusive, respectful of cultures type of society. And some things changed, but in the majority, society remained the same. So after a few years, it was evident that there was a big problem with corruption that was hampering investment on the public sector, but also the fact that most cases go unresolved, no matter what they are, from a street mugging to assassinations, to kidnappings, to violence against women. Pretty much everything goes without any consequences. So one of the presidents after the peace accords, this was Oscar Berger, he started a formal request to United Nations to create a commission that was semi-autonomous, that could operate without the usual ties with government, but with the General Attorney's Office, so the investigators, the prosecutors, to start looking into emblematic cases or high level cases. And we had a first commissioner who did some things, a second commissioner that no one remembers, and finally this commissioner comes, and this Colombian commissioner, and Ivan Velasquez came in and started pushing for these investigations very strongly, and he created a team of researchers that worked very closely with the prosecutors at the public ministry or General Attorney's Office. And for a while, it felt like things were going slowly. And then in 2015, the first big case was announced. It was called La Linea. And it was just at the very first big investigation on corruption and how so many things were connected. And it was in April. And I remember we were really baffled. We were very taken aback by the fact that this created so much anger in the public, among students, among activists. And that's when the Saturdays of protest began, that I think also attracted media attention from different parts of the world. The first publication that I did on elites came around that time because the research had been done in 2014. So the perspectives of the people I interviewed were, yeah, of course we want to fight impunity. Of course we want to fight corruption. Because they really thought that they would never be touched. Like they would prosecute their enemies and the state, but never these private institutions that have been untouchable since 1954. And so the context of CICIG is that from 2015 onwards, just case after case started opening, and people were following it like they were following like a weekly TV drama. So on Thursdays, which were usually the days when cases or progress on cases was announced, they were called Jueves de CICIG, and you would get together with your friends and watch what was coming, because it was really exciting, and it was the first time in our lives, in our history, even my parents' lives, in which something like this was happening. And the problem maybe was that they opened up so many cases, and most of these touched so many different arms of power, including government, that the president that came in after Otto Perez and Roxana Valdetti resigned, Jimmy Morales, once CICIG touched his family, he started sort of like taking back all the support and the structure that had sustained the activities of CICIG, which were the prosecutors, the national police, the Ministry of the Interior. They started firing the heads of these organizations. They started basically dismantling the structure that had allowed this to happen. So by 2017, the commissioner was declared persona non grata. And from then onwards, it just started declining, and CICIG doesn't exist no more, like anymore. It's closed down, and we all think it's never going to come back. It's been worn out to the point where everyone has a very strong opinion about CICIG, no matter who you ask, in favor or against.
And is there a partisan split in terms of the for and against? Is it the private sector now is on the against side, or does it remain, as you say, fractured, that they expect their enemies to be?
Yeah, well, it was more fractured in the beginning because there were many business people who thought that they could side with justice and these investigations, but then because everyone is connected or married to each other or they have business with each other, they started what the book describes. They started to be disciplined. They started losing contracts. They started getting threats from their banks saying your interest will go up if you continue siding with CICIG, or they would cut contracts, stop supply chains. So if you have you have a business that includes factories that require raw materials, and your main providers are a monopoly, so there's no one else you can buy from, then you have to change the way you speak or how publicly you support certain activities. So so they went back into their trenches, and people stopped talking. There were literally many fights within families, between friends, and everyone went back to the trenches. And when I say everyone, I'm talking about big businesses, but also people that are affiliated to any of the chambers, so commerce or agriculture, etc. There are business people who are not as big, or were not part of the organized elites that were punished too, but they were able to continue supporting the activities of CICIG because they were not that connected. But even for them, the stories in the book include people whose jobs were threatened, and they had to make tough decisions between, like, okay, am I going to lose half my contracts and then have to fire people, or do I just stop expressing my opinion? And that's sort of what I describe in the book is what happened from 2017 onwards, when the disciplining started to really pick up.
Let's get into that now. And you call this conglomerate of the private sector or business people, you call them organized private sector, and they're split in two main groups, let's say, the dissidents and the aligned, if that was like a very broad categorization. Can you say something more about who these different groups are, or if there's like a specific characterization of them, and how this split comes about, or where its origins lie?
Well, it's very simple. The traditional, what we call traditional private sector, is old money, quote unquote, which is 3 or 4 generations, and they started organizing during the time when, between 1944 and 1954, when Guatemala had the first democratic government after many decades of dictators. And it was a social democrat government that modernized the state. This includes starting social security, free education, etc. And so at that time, this old money, or the elites, the agribusiness and factories, thought that they were under threat, that Guatemala may follow the steps of Cuba, and so they organized pretty much to stand against social democrat governments, which they thought would lead to communism. So it's very much a Cold War setup that I think resembles what happened in other countries, that where there was persecution, and there was like witch hunts against people who sided more with a social democratic ideals. And so they set up, and they became really, really strong. So during different legislators, they had been able to secure decision-making positions in for agriculture, for business, at the banks, etc. So although they call themselves private sector, they have a presence in key decision making positions in that concern government. And so this is the old money, and it's quote unquote old money because it's not that old. And if you look back at their histories, a lot of their fortunes were built because of laws that favored immigration from Europe, or laws that enabled farmers to get indentured servants. And these laws of indentured work did not disappear until 1944. So it's very, very recent that you could start a big coffee emporium, if you will, with a lot of free labor. And they're the ones that way of thinking is the one that's represented here, plus some of the newer service, restaurant, real estate businesses. But it's really very homogeneous in terms of being white, or culturally white, maybe not necessarily genetically white, but culturally white, very endogamous, very secluded, very kind of protective of their status quo. And then the rest, which I would call the rest, the ones that may want things to change, are those that are not favored by these laws that favor monopolies, are not favored by these laws that tend to side with a bigger contractor, etc. And these are definitely new, one generation, maybe 2 generation, and some dissidents from this old style. Like, so there are a few agribusiness families that have decided to step away from these traditional chambers or exporters, etc. But they're still a minority. It's still not equally distributed. And those are, I would say, those that are based on in cities. And then you have the rest of Guatemala, where there is a private sector that in every place, Guatemala, because of the absence of the states of the government from 1954 onwards, it's a very it's a society that relies on itself. It's very self-sufficient because the government has never done anything, so people just sort out their lives. And I always find it fascinating to compare with Mexico, where you cross the border, you have pretty much the same ethnicities, you have the same language, you have the same historical dynamics, but once you cross over, you have all these services that are offered by government. And as much as Mexicans criticize their social services, you have social services, we don't. And so for us, it's just mesmerizing to compare what happens. Like, there's insurance if there are sort of climatic disasters, people can get back on their feet with help of the state. None of this happens in Guatemala. So people outside the cities are worried about themselves and their businesses, and the state has never been there for them, so they don't really care what happens in the capital city. To be honest, it's irrelevant.
And the private sector, it comes in to kind of fill that void of or lack of state, or what is their role in society?
I mean, there's always this effort to privatize the whatever is run by the state, like they did with the phone companies, or they did with the postal service. We have a privatized postal service in Guatemala, and other services. But it's not like they're trying to get out and provide them all across the country. So it is really, you're on your own when you go to smaller cities or smaller towns in Guatemala. It's the local private sector, and you can see the presence of the big private sector in terms of the services and commodities that are offered, but it's not really a presence beyond these goods, like services and goods. And their interest is mostly on ensuring that their businesses can continue as always, without the intromission of the state. Mm-hmm.
And that's something very obvious in your book, that it's clearly about the elites and the fights of elites amongst themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest of the population is really not so is not really involved in these discussions,
Mm-hmm.
or is not allowed to be involved. Can you say something about this internal fight, about the disciplining that you mentioned already, that the book is really about, before we talk about the rest of the population, how they relate to it?
Yes. So one of the disciplining comes from different angles. One way to let a relative know that he or she is stepping out of what's expected, or the political views that are endorsed by the group, is to really make your social life miserable, like confront you in public at social gatherings, uninvite you from. So some of it may seem very superficial, but it's really your entire network that turns their back on you. And so you get complaints from relatives, you get chided by older relatives, you get a point like saying, well, you're sort of like betraying the family, and this sort of betrayal, this idea that you're betraying your class, it's very powerful. No one wants to lose friends, and that's one. But then you have the more serious consequences, like economic damage to your company, not being able to get the raw materials that you need to produce your product, no matter what it is, or contracts that are ended without much explanation, getting fired or getting pressured to be fired from your job, basically losing status in general, are ways of disciplining. And then we have another category, which it's more harassment, kind of by police. Like, they've sent some people have been kind of stopped randomly, quote unquote, by police, and searched for no reason, just as a warning. So so it can escalate. There are some stories of people who are just imprisoned for the night, for spurious charges, and they know exactly it's to send the message that they have to shut up, they have to stop pointing out to these incongruent positions by the organized private sector regarding government.
Guatemala is also quite a violent country compared to other countries. I mean, there is probably a good reason to fear if you get these sort of messages.
It is very, things can escalate very quickly, and there is sort of like a socially granted permission to be violent and to blame the victim. So there's the usual saying, en algo estaba metido, when someone gets killed, or it's, well, he must have been involved in something. And that's a way to discard the seriousness of the everyday violence, the everyday threats. And so a few of the people that I interviewed for this book have left the country, or have changed other fields of work, like they quit journalism, etc. Because I do talk in the book also to journalists and people in media who are also disciplined for continuing to follow what was going on in terms of the CICIG investigations.
I remember in 2008 or 9, when I was living in Guatemala, there was a change in the gun laws, and that's one significant difference with Mexico, for example, where guns are not legal, and in Guatemala they are. There was a limitation on the ammunition that you were allowed to carry, and it was limited from unlimited to 1,000 pieces or something like that, and there was an outrage.
Yeah, it was.
So is that also a cultural thing?
It is, but I'd say it's very, it's a city thing, but also of Eastern Guatemala, where there's a lot of gun culture. Maya communities are actually there are two Guatemalas. There's the Ladino or Mestizo Guatemala, the urban Mestizo, and there's the rural Maya, where there's the rates of homicides in rural Guatemala are as low as Denmark or I don't know, Netherlands. The rates of homicide in Guatemala City and some of the eastern cities are worse than Iraq or Afghanistan. So there's huge gaps.
And this whole two Guatemalas, there's probably more. There are different worlds, right? That's also something that we have talked about before, which is also something that I observe in elite studies in Mexico. But that there's a disconnect not only between urban and rural, but between the elites and the rest of society.
Yeah.
And to come back to that kind of absence of the rest of society in the whole discussion, intra-elite conflict, how is the reaction from the rest of society when they hear or read about these discussions?
When back in 2015, when I would go protesting almost every Saturday, and I have to admit that I went to the protest mostly to support friends and colleagues and students, because I was not very, I'm a very skeptical person regarding social change. But I would go every Saturday, and when they, excuse me, I got a cab to go back. And one thing that always struck me was that in downtown Guatemala, you would have the protesters every Saturday, and some Saturdays would be huge. But you also have people that were spending their Saturdays with their families there, eating out, just walking around, having just like a relaxing Saturday. And it seemed like these two worlds never met. And I was always curious as why these people would see us every single Saturday and they didn't want to get involved. But one taxi driver explained to me, I think in the best way, he said, I got into the cab and he said to me, yeah, I get you get the chance to come because you have that privilege. I'm just concerned about not getting killed every day. I'm just worried that I get back home to my family. So I cannot afford myself the luxury of protesting. And I think that pretty much summarizes it. People who are worried about their survival, either because their work implies a lot of danger, or because their economic situation is very precarious because of climate change and because of lost crops, or because of different things. It's really unfair to expect them to participate in protesting over things that really do not affect them, whether they change or not, or would affect them in the real long term, not immediately. So there's always been this divide, and then on the other side, when you see the protests that come from rural areas, you see very little implication from city people into these protests or support some of these causes, because it's basically different worlds and different concerns.
It's quite amazing to think that even if things changed for the elites, that would have little impact on the rest of the population.
Or at least in the short term, I do think that, because I did think that we were on the right track with investigations, although there were maybe some exaggerations or abuses of power. We were on the right track because the state was becoming more predictable. And I think if you can predict how the government is going to react, how institutions are going to respond to your needs, then you can concentrate on building a better society or in improving your context and improve the lives around you, because you don't have to worry about the inefficiency, the utter inefficiency of the state. You can at least predict some things will happen. And everything kind of dissolved afterwards. From 2017 to now, it just gotten worse and worse and worse. So now nothing is predictable. And we're back in a position where we're about to have a new general attorney, and the front runner is someone who openly and overtly sides with the most extreme former military group of right-wing politicians. So you kind of think, if this person is at the head of investigations, at the head of making sure that justice is provided with the right information to make decisions, what can we expect? And for everything else, it's been like that. It has become uphill again. And I think that affects not only the elites, it affects everyone. But the way it arrives, like the consequences arrive in ways that are hard to connect to what's happening in the city. Mm-hmm.
And what is the outlook? What can we expect, or should we expect?
I think because everything pretty much was eroded, not only the executive, but also in terms of the justice system. Many of the judges that took on cases that were emblematic regarding crimes against humanity, cases that involved extreme violence or big cases of corruption, are under threat. Many have left, are in exile because they fear persecution. And as the courts have changed too, the likeliness that you will be punished with jail time for having attempted to bring justice where economic elites were involved, it's very, very scary. So I think we're in a very fragile situation right now. And for the next few years, it's going to be really hard to find some secure footing to rebuild some of these institutions.
It's not a very hopeful note to come to a close. So I'll ask you something else.
Yeah. No, but there is hope, and there I mean, having said that, having expressed my utter disbelief in government's capacity to rebuild itself, because of Guatemalans' historical need to rely on themselves, you can see how in rural areas more than in urban areas, because that's, I think, space-wise, you can see territories more easily. You can see how community-based organization or producers organizations, etc., have found ways to protect themselves, and we saw it during COVID. And the part of the book, like the book, talks also in the end about COVID and how the research was done when the pandemic was beginning. But I have also continued doing research on how resilience takes different forms and shapes in rural areas, and how governance, in the end, governance happens in at smaller scales and without the help of government. And we can see during COVID how many of these organizations found ways to protect their populations and get them food and get them some sort of certainty for the worst months of the pandemic. So my hope really lies on people's capacity to organize themselves and to find ways to be resilient without any help from the government or any interference, because that's kind of how people see it. It's like we don't want people like government interfering with our lives. That's how a lot of people will frame it. So we can say these are like the true libertarians are the rural Guatemalans that want nothing to do with government.
Well, they have a good reason to be skeptical.
Yes.
From their historical perspective. Alejandra, one last question, because you were talking about something a moment ago in terms of what is expected of people. And I wanted to ask you about your specific position or your personal role in this research, because of course it's not easy to access information and people that have these powerful positions, and with it comes a certain risk as well, and maybe also a personal risk considering the situation. Are you okay?
I think I'm comfortable in this position where I'm uncomfortable to people. On one side, because I look and I sound like someone from the elites. I get sometimes a lot of criticism and skepticism from certain groups that kind of put all white people into the same box and think that there is no way someone like myself would truly be interested in supporting causes that are not those of my supposed class, because class depends on many more factors. But as in Mexico and other Latin American countries, phenotype really kind of puts you in a certain slot. And I think you know that really well. Like, there's an advantage to passing like someone from the elites, because you can go into offices of people, into CEOs' offices, and no one will question your presence if they just look at you. But at the same time, there's this feeling that, or this idea that I am betraying my class by looking inside and criticizing it, or questioning it more than criticizing it. Because I do my work from a cognitive anthropological perspective, the criticizing comes from the people themselves. Like, I'm just organizing the voices of people in the text. I'm not saying much. I'm just putting together the ideas. And I'm always very wary about putting too much of my ideas into the analysis. Because I think what people say explains things very, very well. I don't need to put a lot of it into the text. And so it's a very uncomfortable position sometimes, but I think it's more uncomfortable to them than to me. I feel like if I walk into a restaurant and they look at me weird, I'll still have a nice time, but maybe their meal will be ruined. So, and on the other hand, other people that you've never think have the same opinions have come to me after reading the book and saying, like, what you're saying, that what you put in that book represents my own experience, how people who consider themselves conservative have been disciplined too, just for questioning or asking, maybe we should listen to other people's opinions. And it has been in many ways beautiful and sad to see how people you would never think about, attorneys or business people or professors, etc., say, I see what you're seeing. I see exactly this. I don't know how to change it. I don't know how to turn the tide around. So at least I think we're more than people actually think. And since the book, I've met many more of these people, and I think eventually things will change. But we do need to take on a lot of responsibilities that in normal countries are not really the task of citizens.
Well, maybe you did your part for the changing of the tide to come now, starting or continuing a conversation about these subjects.
Yes, and that's why I'm moving my research more to these smaller dimensions of governance, where people have sorted out a way to create predictable institutions, even if there's at a small scale. And that's where I'm concentrating now, in part for research curiosity, but also for mental health reasons.
That is perfectly understandable. And I'm looking very much forward to reading about that as well. Alejandra, thank you so much
Thank you so much
sharing
for the
your
space.
insights.
Looking forward to listening more, and thank you for the time. Talk to you soon.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for listening to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams. We were discussing Alejandra Colom's book, Dissidence and Discipline. If you read Spanish, go and get it. Else wait for the English version coming out soon. And we hope that you want to join us again next time when we will talk about another aspect of inequality here at Futures Frame TV. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.